The Bible, one of the most influential books in human history, is not a single volume but a collection of texts that were compiled over centuries, written by different authors at various times and in distinct contexts. The formation of the Bible, with its texts we know today as the Old and New Testaments, involved a complex selection of writings that underwent rigorous evaluation and analysis by religious communities and spiritual leaders. Additionally, while some texts were incorporated, others were excluded, resulting in the current canon. Many people ask the question, how exactly was the Bible compiled, and why were certain books excluded? To understand the process of compiling the Bible, it is important to consider the history of religious texts and the context of the societies in which these writings were produced and preserved. The Old Testament, or Tanakh for the Jews, constitutes the first part of the Christian Bible and was mainly written in Hebrew, with some sections in Aramaic. These texts form the core of Jewish faith, narrating from the creation of the world to the stories of the patriarchs, prophets, and the special relationship of the Jewish people with God. The transmission of these texts began orally, with stories and teachings passed down from generation to generation before being finally written down. The process of writing and preserving these sacred texts began around the 10th century BCE and continued until approximately the 2nd century BCE. The oral transmission and subsequent writing of the Old Testament texts played a crucial role in preserving the Jewish religious tradition. The compilation of the books that make up the Old Testament went through various stages of selection, where they sought to ensure that the chosen texts were consistent with religious doctrine and tradition. One of the main criteria for including books was the antiquity of the texts. Books that recounted ancient events in the history of the Jewish people, written in Hebrew or Aramaic and considered divinely inspired, were more likely to be accepted. Another criterion was authorship. Texts attributed to figures of authority, such as Moses, or to prophets and religious leaders, were more valued and considered worthy of being preserved in the canon. However, there were many texts written around the same time that were not accepted as part of the Old Testament canon. These texts are known as apocryphal or pseudepigraphal books, referring to works that were excluded from the official canon but still circulated widely among religious communities. Examples of apocryphal books include the Book of Enoch, the Book of Tobit, the Book of Judith, and the books of the Maccabees. The inclusion or exclusion of these texts from the canon was influenced by various factors, including the theological content of the texts, the historical context in which they were written, and later, political issues. Often, these books were considered non-canonical because they were perceived as not being divinely inspired or containing doctrines or practices that did not align with accepted religious beliefs. The formation of the New Testament, which is the second part of the Christian Bible, followed a different path than the Old Testament. The New Testament consists of writings centered on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, as well as the early years of Christianity and the spread of the Christian message by the apostles. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the central texts of the New Testament, and their inclusion in the Christian canon is widely accepted among different Christian denominations. Besides the Gospels, the New Testament includes the epistles of Paul and other apostles, containing teachings and guidance for the early Christian communities, as well as the Book of Revelation, which presents a prophetic vision of the end times. The compilation of the New Testament began in the 1st century CE, with the texts being copied and circulated among Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire. Paul's letters, which were among the first to be written, were addressed to various churches and addressed issues of Christian doctrine and conduct. These letters gained significant importance and were quickly accepted as authentic by most Christian communities, facilitating their inclusion in the canon. However, other texts, such as some Gospels considered apocryphal, also circulated among Christians but were viewed with skepticism and ultimately rejected by the church councils that discussed the canon. An important milestone in the canonization process of the New Testament was the Council of Nicaea, held in 325 CE. Although this council did not formally define the canon, it marked the beginning of a process of standardizing Christian texts. Subsequent councils, such as the Council of Hippo, 393 CE, and the Council of Carthage, 397 CE, played a crucial role in defining the New Testament books. The criteria for inclusion included apostolic authorship, texts attributed to apostles or their close associates, orthodoxy, conformity with Christian doctrine, liturgical use, if the text was widely used in churches, and general acceptance among Christian communities. These selection criteria were used to establish which books would be considered inspired and therefore worthy of inclusion in the New Testament. Texts that did not meet these criteria were considered apocryphal or pseudepigraphal. Some examples of apocryphal New Testament books include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Peter. These texts were excluded because they presented doctrines or accounts of Jesus' life that differed significantly from those accepted by most Christian communities. Additionally, many of these texts were written by groups considered heretical, such as the Gnostics, who held a mystical and esoteric interpretation of Jesus' teachings. The exclusion of these texts was also influenced by political and theological issues. During the period when Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, there was a need to unify Christian beliefs and practices to strengthen the Church's identity. This led to the rejection of texts that could generate divisions and conflicting interpretations. Thus, books that were popular in certain regions but did not have widespread acceptance or promoted ideas seen as heretical were left out of the canon. Another important aspect to consider is the influence of ancient codices, such as the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which are some of the oldest and most complete copies of the New Testament. These manuscripts played a crucial role in preserving the texts and deciding which books should be included or excluded from the canon. However, even with the existence of these codices, the Bible's canonization process was not entirely uniform, and different Christian traditions developed their own canons over the centuries. The Orthodox Church, for example, accepts some books that the Catholic Church considers apocryphal, and Protestant churches have a different canon from the one adopted by the Catholic Church. Therefore, the exclusion of certain books from the Bible was not an arbitrary process but rather a decision based on a combination of factors, including authorship, doctrinal conformity, liturgical use, and acceptance among communities. This selection process was influenced by both theological and political considerations as Christianity became an official religion and needed to establish a clear and unified set of beliefs. The exclusion of apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books, such as the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, reflects the Church's effort to preserve a doctrine that was widely accepted and that did not give rise to conflicting or heretical interpretations. The decision about which books were included in the Bible we have today was therefore not a simple choice. Over the centuries, the Church sought to unify and establish a body of texts that would represent the central message of Christianity and align with religious tradition. Meanwhile, the excluded books, which still exist and are studied by historians and theologians, offer an intriguing and often mysterious glimpse into how the early Christian communities understood spirituality and the role of Jesus Christ. They provide a window into the diversity of thought that existed in the early centuries of Christianity and demonstrate how the Church worked to establish a common foundation of faith and doctrine. Today, many of these apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books are still read and studied, albeit outside the context of the official biblical canon. For many scholars and believers, these texts continue to be a source of inspiration and reflection, offering a broader view of Christian history and tradition. By looking at these texts with respect and discernment, one can better understand the decisions that shaped the Bible as we know it and how the Church sought to preserve its doctrine and strengthen its identity over the centuries. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the Bible and the process that made it the book we know today. But I want to know what you think about it. Do you believe any of these excluded books should have been included in the Bible? Or do you have any opinion on the criteria used to choose the texts that are part of it? Leave your comments below. I'll be reading and responding to everyone, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take this moment to subscribe and activate the notification bell because we have a lot more profound and intriguing content coming up. Oh, and don't forget to leave a like to support the channel. God bless you.